Hello, everyone. Welcome to Queering Harm Reduction Lessons Learned from Lighthouse Learning Collective. I just want to let everybody know that if there are questions, I would like to be able to answer them in real time, right? And thank you also for people that are on site in Melbourne, because I know it's 10 o'clock. I'm going to try to make this as exciting as possible. It's 8 a.m. in the morning where I am coming to you from Connecticut, although this program is based out of New York City. So don't worry, I'm not super far. I hop on a train once a month to go into the city, and it's enjoyable. So we can get the slides up just so people, thank you. That looks so nice. So yeah, as I said, ask your questions on the side. I was boasting before that I have 3 screens up, so I should be able to capture everything. So if there is a question, if there's a comment, and also what would be cool too, to know what other people are doing around the world, around the globe, because although I think what I do is really special and one of its kind, it could be the case that somebody out there has something similar to Lighthouse. I think I even saw in the program that there is a program possibly I think it was out of Vietnam that's also called Lighthouse, which is really cool because I love that people are using the metaphor lighthouse because a lighthouse does what? It guides folks, so it's guiding our work. So I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit. We'll hop in. I tried to keep the slides to a minimum because I know we are short on time. And I was joking before that normally we're training for a couple hours at a time. So I feel like this is probably going to be more difficult to synthesize everything in under half an hour. But for those who just joined, this is Queering Harm Reduction, Lessons Learned from Lighthouse Learning Collective. My name is Taylor Edelman. My pronouns are he, him, his. I work for the National Harm Reduction Coalition, but as you can see, the program I manage is the Lighthouse Learning Collective. So I actually joined NHRC last March of 2022. So it's only been a year, but I feel like we've done an awful lot in a year's time. And that's what I'm going to walk you through today. But to give you a little backstory, my history is entirely in direct service. So I've been working in community health for the last decade, which feels weird to say because it makes me feel old. But my start really was I wanted to be a provider. I wanted to be a doctor. So I was going to a medical program in my state. And then our 2016 election happened with Donald Trump. And understandably, there were a lot of issues that were coming up, emerging in the queer community, in my community, the trans community, just feeling a sense of urgency. So that's what made me make the jump into community health. I started working as a community health worker, became licensed, and I still am today a community health worker in the state of Connecticut where I live, and started working in chronic disease management, was doing more diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, your typical kind of primary care stuff to support the providers at the clinic. And then really became hungry for more information. And that turned into more HIV prevention, Hep C work. I then became an HIV case manager for many years, which I think really helped inform a lot of the work that I do today. And I don't think that I would be in this position if I didn't have any of those prior experiences to really understand and know what the frontline staff at a lot of the syringe service programs and other community programs are interfacing with, interacting with their clients, with their participants. And then after that, I worked at a syringe service program, built an entire communications department because you know how it is a nonprofit life. You have to be good at everything all the time for not very much money, but you do it because you love it. And then you run the risk of burning out, right? So now it's really interesting being on the program management side. And like I said, I think a lot of the experiences I've had with case management, doing community health work, doing a lot of that direct service work has just been instrumental to this process. So we can advance to the next slide. So Lighthouse Learning Collective, I'll give you a second. Yeah, so this is probably the most difficult question to actually answer when I was creating the slide deck because I think it's morphed so much. So just to give background, I jumped into this when I started March of last year. I jumped into this in year 3 of our 5-year fiscal cycle. So Lighthouse gets funded in 5-year increments. We've actually had this grant, the National Harm Reduction Coalition. since 2013. So it's been 10 years of this work, and the work plan hasn't changed too much, but I can go into a little bit more detail. So we are funded by the AIDS Institute, which is through the New York Department of Health. Um, our funding also increased this year and going into next year because the governor of New York issued more funds to the AIDS Institute and the LGBT network, which is a connected network of about 70 plus LGBTQIA plus serving organizations in the state of New York. And we're part of that. And I was actually telling Mickley and Mon that this conference tends to overlap or actually has overlapped with a retreat, a mandatory retreat for that network because they are a funder. So there's just a lot going on right now. But with that, the focus since 2013 has stayed fairly the same. When I first came in and reviewed a lot of the work plans, a lot of it's focused on access to care, mental health, LGBTQ cultural competency, which we know a lot of people are moving away from and moving more into cultural humility, because the whole idea is you can never be competent in somebody else's culture, right? But you have this ever-present understanding and learning, and it's a process, right? So largely what Lighthouse has morphed into in the time that I've been the program manager, because there was somebody managing the program prior, is really this space, as it says here, to offer strategy, to offer support, resources for queer folks. So LGBTQIA plus folks who use drugs and also do sex work. So it's really, really integral to the work we're doing. And I'll talk a little bit about a project we currently have going on right now, tapping into folks on the ground. But the whole idea behind this is that, you know, there are 14 certain service programs in New York City. There's a number of harm reduction programs, but they aren't providing services to LGBTQIA plus folks in the way that those participants need services. And on the other end, with the LGBTQIA orgs, they are doing what they're doing really well, but they're not exactly well versed in harm reduction, or harm reduction as we might know it in some of these spaces, right? So where Lighthouse sits is at that crossroads, at that intersection, to talk to both of these orgs, right, or both sets of these orgs, and figure out a way to converge the two and to align them a little bit more. And so that shows up in a few different ways of the work, which is really exciting. We can go to the next slide. So I think the one thing I do want to mention, though, the piece that is different is that originally in 2013, the way that the work plan and the grant was written is that there was a community forum. So there was, instead of the monthly meetings that we have now that I'm going to talk about in just a second, there was a community forum that was supposed to be held with these queer harm reduction providers or folks that were adjacent and working in the work to provide a platform. So it's exciting to see how that's evolved as well. So with Lighthouse, as I explained, the whole idea behind this is to really push more collaboration, push more capacity building, technical assistance, and support to these harm reduction organizations and to these LGBTQI plus serving organizations. Because although they might mean well and they do what they do really well, I think that there has just not been the crossover, right? And that could be completely unintentional, could also be intentional, right? But I think largely the way that funding is shaped, grants are shaped, I think deliverables are shaped. I haven't seen in my experience a lot of the crossover necessary. And that's also something with our funder, right? Because these organizations are getting funded by the Department of Health, the New York City Department of Health. And so I'm getting funded through the New York State Department of Health, because New York is a very, very large state, and New York City is not representative of the entire state. But my purview for Lighthouse is all 5 boroughs in New York City. So there's still a lot of ground to cover, because if you know anything about New York City, it's incredibly large, millions and millions of people. So the way that we try to tackle this issue of sitting at the crossroads of both of these sets of organizations, if you will, is to provide that training, to provide that technical assistance and guide organizations, which is something that the TA part we're exploring more this coming year, because our fiscal year is going to end April of 2024. So next year will be the end of our 5-year cycle. So this summer I'm going to be very busy with our staff reapplying, hopefully to get another 5 years of funding to continue the work. Next slide. So part of actually a large part of Lighthouse are these monthly meetings, and they're an hour and a half long, which seems really, really long, but the format has worked well. Also, what's worked well, if you are someone that facilitates or runs meetings regularly, you know that consistency is paramount. It's really key. So we've tried to keep these to the last Monday of the month. We usually have them 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, because one of the things that we've really noticed, or that I've noticed in doing this work, is although this is a New York City program, given that uh, COVID happened and emerged right when the other program manager prior to me stepping in came in, COVID happened and they weren't able to have in-person meetings, so they had to shift everything virtually, which could be good and bad, right? Because I think a lot of folks are hungry for more in-person interaction, but what I've noticed with the virtual meetings is that it's opened up the capacity and ability for other people outside of New York to be involved. And I wouldn't say it's an issue, but it's something I've made the state aware of to say that, although I know these funds are New York City funds, which is our focus and all of our work happens there, uh, I'm not one to say, hey, you're from California, hey, you're from Colorado, you're from Georgia, you can't be in this space, because what I realize is that in allowing other folks outside to really step in and interact and collaborate with one another, they have helped each other instrumentally. I mean, there was a situation in somebody I know, a Black trans sex worker, who has tons of lived experience and who's part of the collective. There was a sex worker collective organizing out in Detroit, Michigan, and they were asking if there was somebody in New York City they could speak to. So it's a perfect example of, hey, I know somebody, let me make that connection. And even if they don't come to the meeting every time, and that's another stipulation, nobody needs to come to a meeting every single time. People are allowed freely to come and go. Because another thing is that even though these are not recorded, just due to a lot of the personal lived experiences that people are sharing during meetings, which is also great because it tells me that we're cultivating a safer space, right? The minutes are really detailed. It's a collaborative agenda. So I open up a Google Doc, probably not unlike a lot of folks, and we have people interact constantly. And one of the graphics, actually, the graphic that's on the screen from our September meeting of last year was, I don't know if anybody loves Canva here. I love Canva. I use it for everything, all the social media stuff. But I had the group go into Canva and basically said, all right, what do we want to learn about? Right? So I had come in March, think I got the meetings up in April, tried to take stock of what worked, what didn't work. And a lot of people were talking about, well, I want to learn about the overdose prevention centers in New York City because you all know United States is very, very behind. But in New York City, we have the delight in having the two overdose prevention city centers in the city. So that's on point. Folks unfamiliar, they want to learn about that. They want zines. They want information on safer snorting. They want information on boofing. They want toolkits, gender affirming care toolkits. Um, so it's been amazing to see them interact in real time. It's also nice to know that we have a really consistent, robust group of people of about 20 to 30 that come to each meeting. So although I probably have about 130, um, oh, it's okay, Mon. You can go to the next slide. That was actually a good prompt for me. So that's one thing, is that there are probably about 120, 130 people on our mail list and about 20 to 30 that show up, which is good because we're also getting new people each time and we're getting people returning and we're getting a really good mixture of folks from diverse backgrounds. So we have people working in healthcare, we have people at certain service programs, we have people that work in housing programs, we have people that work in mental health. So it's been a really exciting, diverse array of folks. Sex worker collective, sex workers organizing. That's a big piece of the work too. So one of the largest things is capacity building, and that even goes for NHRC, is just training, training, training. I tell people 80% of my job is training people, talking to people multiple times a week, and I love it. Sure, it can be exhausting, but I love it. But with Lighthouse because we're supposed to be providing the support, these trainings to the SSPs, the syringe service programs, and the queer-led organizations and serving organizations. We're noticing that, the LGBT health centers like Cal and Lord, which is LGBT health clinic. They do everything from mental health, they do medical care, case management, lots of buy-in from those organizations. But on the flip side, having a lot of issues making connections with the syringe service programs, which is interesting because we have a really long-standing history with them. So why is that? And what have we done to engage them? So I can't tell you exactly why. Again, I don't know if it's just an oversight thing or people are thinking what they're doing is already working really well. But what we did with the collective is together, we're like, well, what if we have a series of trainings, right? So that's how the Lighthouse Learning Series came to be. So that's our 8-part queer harm reduction training series that's been going on since January. It's actually wrapping up not this week, but the next. On April 28th is our last session because we had to reschedule one of them. So we actually have ChemSex 101 this Friday that's going to be done by a provider who's part of the collective, but down in Washington, D.C., who specializes not only in primary care, but ChemSex, which also, oddly enough, is somebody that I met here in Connecticut about 5 years ago at a pharma dinner when I was doing case management, and it's just really interesting and lets you know how small the community is. And this was actually somebody that one of the collective members referred me to, didn't put the name together, didn't put two and two together until I had a Zoom meeting with them and was like, oh my gosh, this is so serendipitous. Um, so the Lighthouse Learning Series, we crafted it to incorporate the specialties or expertise of collective members and also ask them, are there people in the community that could do this or do that, that has like a youth focus or has more of like a mental health focus or disability justice focus, and they delivered. So originally I had done a Google form just to collect information. And what ended up happening is that we had sex work, we had queer youth who use drugs, sexual and reproductive health, disability justice. One was QT BIPOC empowerment and harm reduction, which focused more on mental health and non-carceral forms of care. Queer history of harm reduction, which is our last session this month. Cultivating affirming workspaces, and then ChemSex 101. So it's really been well received. We've had, I would say, on average, about 200 plus registrants, which is exciting. None of the sessions have been recorded though, because a lot of them have had disclosures happen during the sessions. But one of the things, the biggest outcomes of this was two of the certain service programs that were previously not connected with ended up reaching out and said, hey, somebody passed this along to me, or we saw your last session. Is there a way that we could do more of this work? Is there a way that we can incorporate more of this like queer harm reduction lens into our work? Because we may think we're doing a good job, but we have a lot of case managers, we have a lot of frontline staff that are encountering, LGBTGNC plus folks, and we're just having questions, or we want to, make sure that the staff is aware, right? So that was pretty cool to see. It was like a direct relationship of providing this huge labor intensive, time intensive training series, and then getting that feedback from the syringe service programs, which they really were the focus. So I'm glad they picked up on it. Next slide. So with technical assistance, essentially, we know that's providing really targeted and focused support and guidance to programs that are looking to make their programs more accessible and more affirming for LGBTGNC plus folks. So one of the biggest projects, and actually I'm so relieved to be able to tell you that the last 2 weeks I've spent interviewing almost, I think it was about 8 or 9 consultants for a toolkit. So one of the things from that initial whiteboard in Canva that I showed you is that people wanted a toolkit. Originally, the idea, the origin was an HRT toolkit. So talking about hormone therapy and what that looks like. So not just estrogen and, not just testosterone, but also what are the effects when people come off? Because we know one of the things with a lot of this anti-trans legislation, anti-LGBTQ legislation in the United States and even worldwide is that people are inevitably going to be forced to detransition, which is terrible. But I feel like, and the collective feels like, nobody is really focusing on, what to expect, right, when you are going through that, right? There's a lot of guides that talk about, oh, expect these changes and this and that, and this is a timeline. But as we started to talk about this more, people were like, well, can we add in this piece on organizational accountability? Can we add in this piece on, specific substances and safer use? So what this ended up being is a really comprehensive and ambitious idea for a gender affirming care toolkit for all 14 of the syringe service programs, which will be available April of 2024. And people are asking, yes, it's for New York City, but is this something we'll be able to use in our state, in our locale, in our region? And I would like to say yes, because the whole idea behind it is that it's a conversation starter. It's a jumping off point. We're going to try to make this a really fun and interactive guide for the people working at syringe service programs, but also for the people who attend them, to really be able to hold these organizations accountable for the work that they're doing, or maybe not doing, right? Because I think it's past due time, right? So that's one of the things that we're super excited for. We actually hired a BIPOC trans-led consulting agency to help us develop this. And like I said, this is super fresh. Like the ink is just barely dry on the contract, but we're super excited to get into it. Next slide. So when we talk about collaborative projects, I mentioned the Lighthouse Learning Series. The graphic on that initial slide, if you saw that like orangey graphic with the people's faces, that is the first project that when I came into Lighthouse we did. So I came in March. It was March 17th. What do we know happens at the end of March? March 31st is International Trans Day of Visibility. So one of the things I wanted to do is not only celebrate the day, but how do we celebrate beyond, or right, or how do we acknowledge? Because we also have to acknowledge the fact that not everybody wants to be visible, right? There's an element, especially now, that's really prescient of a lack of safety. So how are we showing up and paying homage to the people that are doing the work? So what I did is I had asked collective members and the community at large, who are the people in your communities? Who are the TGNC and B folks, queer harm reductionists doing great work? Would they be interested in writing a blog post, doing an interview? So we got a good amount of feedback. And in the end, we ended up conducting 6 interviews. So I sat down for about 45 minutes with folks, and we had 2 folks from New York, and then the rest were from out of state. All really just rich discussions. Those are all recorded on our YouTube page. So if you type in HRC Lighthouse, you'll be able to view them all there if you have a lot of extra time, but it's a lot and it almost reads more like a podcast, which is interesting. So out of that, we did the interviews. We got to hear more about people's work and more on their perspectives and their identity and how that interplays. So a lot of rich storytelling, and then that ended up turning into them writing a blog post, which lives on the National Harm Reduction Coalition website, which are also linked on our Lighthouse Learning Collective page, which I'll be able to link everybody to at the end. And there was also a social media post that went along with it, because the whole idea was to try to make it as dynamic as possible, because one of the things that we've been able to leverage quite well is social media, is being on Instagram, is being on Twitter, interacting, overlapping with a lot of these organizations and making things that aesthetically look nice, but also that have really great information. Because what we're realizing, again, with people being outside of New York City, is that there are a lot of people hungry for this information, which is a great thing, but also very telling that we need more spaces like Lighthouse. So even though I would love to do more of this work nationally, very much happy for other folks, other collectives to pick up the baton, so to speak, and run with it. Because the thing that makes this really special is that when you have people working and living and breathing in your specific city or in your locale, it's just going to enhance the service delivery that much more. And that's one thing I've noticed about having more collective members from all over the nation, is that they're able to provide information and nuance. One thing that comes to mind is the drug supply, right? So over on the East Coast, it's very different than the West Coast, or in the South, or in the Midwest. What are we seeing? What does the drug checking look like? So it's endlessly invaluable. Um, Yeah, so another piece of that too is this year for TDEV, we did something a little bit low barrier, a little bit more low barrier, where we had folks write in, what brings them joy? How do they see themselves thriving? What do they imagine like a queer trans future to look like? And so we've turned those into a series of social media posts. And the whole idea behind that was to try to get as many comments as we could to combat the anti-trans legislation happening in the country because I think we're approaching about 500 now, which is really a huge regression and pretty startling. Next slide. So, in preparation for today's presentation, I had asked collective members. I said, I'm going to present at the HRI conference, my first time ever attending, even though I'm not there. At least I'm here virtually in a little square, a little rectangle on your screen. So I said, what do you want them to know about how Lighthouse has had an impact on you? And so I provided 3 quotes here. But this one for folks viewing it is really talking more about the impact that Lighthouse has had in policy. So one of the things that we're looking to do with our next 5 years of funding, if we get it, knock on wood, is to do a little bit more advocacy work. So right now we're heavily tied into Decrim New York, which is a sex worker-led sex work decrim movement, fighting against the equality model or the Nordic model, the legalization model in New York State, and also other LGBT advocacy organizations to make sure that we're standing in solidarity, that we're leveraging kind of the input that we have from collective members. So that's what this person is talking about more, is they were coming from NISCASA, which is the New York Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Sexual Violence. So it was really amazing to see providers from that lens come into the group and say, "Oh, never thought about this. You helped us kind of inform policy and lobby and push it through." Um, so that was really exciting to see. Next slide. So this one, it's a really long one, but I could not stand to cut it. This one was, I almost get emotional reading it because this is really the whole reason why I do this work in the first place, is to have spaces where people don't have to suffer in silence or hide away, and try to cultivate a space where people can truly be their authentic selves, right? So putting the work we do in practice. So this individual, which they attributed an awful lot to me, which I appreciate, and that's not why I put it up here, really speaks to that, right? Really being able to speak to their multiple identities, and to really be able to uh, share their thoughts completely unfettered with the collective. And I believe that that only really enhances the work that we do. Next slide. So this is the last quote here, but this is from someone actually in an organization in the South who is an ED for a syringe service program. Um, and I remember I had a speaker come in from New York City who is like the head of the drug checking team, and they were just completely enamored. And they were also in the process of buying a spectrometer, one of those fancy machines, or somebody had given it to them via grant, whatever it was, and their eyes just lit up. And to see them converse, in real time and share that knowledge, that's what really just sold me on the idea that this work needs to be so much more and so much more comprehensive. Because in New York City, we have access to a lot more resources, right? And sometimes we hoard those resources. And then folks in rural locations don't have the same access to things, and that's something that we want to break down, right? Like, we don't want to be gatekeepers. We don't just want to be another cog in the wheel. So I love that he was speaking to this quite beautifully. All right, and with that, we will go to the last and final slide. So if folks want to stay involved, stay in touch, I put a cute little QR code on the screen, which hopefully works. So that'll link you to our website, which, like I said, lives on the NHRC website. We're also on Instagram and Twitter. Try to keep it easy for you. It's HRC_Lighthouse. So you'll be able to see all of our content that we post, and we're on there a lot, um, because like I said, I try to make sure they're being as collaborative as possible, as responsive as possible to folks' needs. So yeah, with that, let me know if you have any questions. I believe the slides will also be available. So yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the time, everyone being here. This was great. Thank you.